Here is your angling wisdom quote for the week. There is no greater fan of fly fishing than the worm. Patrick McManus. This episode is all about one of my favorite fish, the brook trout. Brookies have been one of my favorite fish and have had a special place in my heart ever since I was a little kid. So today I want you to join me and learn about how to catch these fish, where you can catch these fish, and learn some little known facts about some of our favorite fish to catch up in the mountains, the brookie.
Welcome to the Angling Wisdom Podcast, your go-to source for practical advice and expert insights to enhance your fishing skills. Join us as we explore the science and tactics behind catching diverse freshwater species across North America. We will have expert biologists and anglers share insights into the species we all love to catch. Get ready for the culmination of angling wisdom and fun. I'm your host, Patrick Edwards, and this is the Angling Wisdom Podcast.
All right, this episode is brought to you by PK Lures. Now, let's say that you're going to go up into the mountains and you're going to go after some of these wonderful brook trout. PK has some amazing options for you, whether it's the 8th or 16th ounce PK spoon or PK Predator spoon, or even the 1/4 and 3/8 ounce flutterfish. You can find exactly what you need to go catch some of these brook trout up in the mountains by going to pklure.com. If you go to pklure.com, you can use the code WISDOM at checkout to save 20% on your order. So again, thank you to PK for sponsoring this podcast. Go to pklure.com, use the code WISDOM at checkout for 20% off your order and get some awesome brook trout lures. Like I said, I've always loved brook trout. Brook trout have been one of my favorites ever since I was a little kid. So I'm going to tell you just a little story about how I fell in love with these fish. I remember I was a little kid and I went on this fishing trip with my family, and my dad took us to the Snowy Range Mountains out west of Laramie. And we camped along this little stream, and in the stream, there were a bunch of brook trout. So my dad, he went over and he made me a pole, like literally made me a pole from a willow that was growing along that stream. So he cut a willow. It was probably 6, 7 feet long, and he tied a piece of fly line actually to the end of the piece of willow. And then on that, he tied just a little leader, probably 2 to 3 feet of monofilament. Below that, he put a little eagle claw hook, and then he put a little piece of split shot on it so that it would have a little bit of weight. And he gave me some worms to use. And he said, "You're going to put this into the water. You have to sneak up really quietly. You have to walk really quietly, get down really low so that the fish can't see you," because he said they spook really easy. He said, all you're going to do is you're just going to dip that little worm into the water and you're going to catch a brook trout. And I was like, okay, that sounds pretty cool. And so I went over and tried it. And I remember, I'll never forget this. There's this big rock, and behind it's a little eddy. So where the water flows by and it kind of swirls around in a circle, and it's kind of calm. And so I just dipped that little worm in there after sneaking up on it. And it wasn't 2 seconds of it being in the water, and boom, I could feel something grab it. And I set the hook and lifted out this little brook trout. And I was literally hooked from then on. And I just remember thinking to myself, these are such pretty fish. I mean, they are one of the prettiest fish that you can catch. But also, it was just really fun as a kid being able to go up and catch them that way. So I've loved brookies ever since I was a little kid. We ate a whole bunch of them that night around the campfire. I remember my mom loved them. And so I wanted to do a special on brook trout because I actually did a trip this summer with my friend Seth and my family, and we went up and we caught some monster brook trout. And I've aspired my whole life to catch big brookies because typically they don't get very big. Usually in Wyoming, if you're fishing in the backcountry, you're going to find them in streams. You're going to find them in little lakes, and they're usually like 7 to 10 inches long. And so catching big ones is obviously really cool. But I was like, it would be a really fun podcast episode to talk about brook trout because they are so cool. They're kind of all over the place anymore. They didn't used to be that way, but we'll talk about the history of them. And there's some really cool things about them that a lot of people don't know. So we're just going to dive right in. Like I said, one of my favorite fish. If you're talking about brookies, depending on where you're at in the country, you might hear different names. So some of the names that you hear are brookie, brook trout, speckled trout. And obviously, I use the term brookie, and I think most people in the West do. But I think depending on where you're at geographically, the name will change a little bit. They're really easy to identify. If you've never seen a brook trout, I'm going to put one up here on the screen. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see them. They are absolutely gorgeous. And they have blue and red and green and are just really vibrant colors. I love their fins, especially when they're bright red with that splash of white along the edge. They're just absolutely beautiful. But like the worm trails on their backs, that's what I call them, are called vermiculations. And so it's basically like that yellow and green kind of wormwood pattern that goes along their backs. It is just one of the coolest looking things. So if you've ever caught a brookie, you held them in your hand, you looked at them, you're like, man, this is one of the prettiest fish swimming. And I mean, they are super, super cool. But they originated actually in the Northeast all the way down to the southeast part of the United States. So all the way from up in Canada, all the way down that coastline, almost all the way down to the south. They can only handle water temps up to a certain temperature, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, from way up in Quebec all the way down into Georgia. And a lot of the people down south actually call them speckled trout. So that's something to know. But one thing that I didn't know, and so I learned something new doing the research for this podcast, is that there's actually some brookies that are out in the ocean, kind of like steelhead and browns do. I didn't realize that they did that, and they're called salters. And so they can live in the ocean and come up rivers to spawn. Surprisingly, they don't get huge. Like when you think about steelhead versus like a regular rainbow trout, steelhead get really big, right? And sometimes rainbow trout do, sometimes they don't. But like steelhead typically can be super long and super big, but really brookies will kind of top out at that 4 pound range for the salters, which I thought was really interesting. I actually got that from an encyclopedia fish thing that I have here next to me for some of my research. And then you have the fish that stay in freshwater, and they're landlocked. I mean, all the fish in Wyoming, as far as brookies go, that's how they are. So that's just what I'm used to. But I didn't realize that that happened. So that was kind of cool to learn. But ever since about the 1850s, brook trout have been expanded and have been taken all over the place. So you think about, they're all kind of geographically along that northeast side of the country, and Canada and the United States. And then they just got kind of taken all over, including Europe, New Zealand, lots of other places, South America. So brookies have been taken all over the place. And I think it's because they're really pretty. They're fun to catch. They're cool looking fish. So I think that that's why a lot of them were taken to different areas of the world. But they're also used to make a few different hybrids, which are some of my favorites. So if you've ever heard of a splake or a tiger trout, they use brook trout to make those. So a splake is a brook trout and lake trout mix, and a tiger trout is a brown trout brook trout mix. And those two hybrids are really, really pretty and really fun to catch. So if you haven't caught any of those, you can catch them here in Wyoming and many other states, but they do use those hybrids. And the reason that they do that is, one, they don't want them to breed. They want them to be sterile. They want them to just go out and do their job. And typically what that job is they are a little more piscivorous. They like to eat other fish. The fish and game and fish, depending on your state, will typically put those in a body of water to help control sucker species, minnow species. So they put them out there so that they'll help control some of that population. They're not super effective, especially once those sucker and minnow species get a little bit bigger. But for the smaller ones, they're very effective because they like to eat other fish. When you start talking about some of those bigger suckers in control, you want to get like tiger muskies and things like that, which are a cross between northern pike and muskie. And we'll talk about those in another episode, which will be really fun. So you'll want to check that one out. But splake and tiger trout are super cool. So if you ever get a chance, add that to your list. They're really pretty. They're really fun to catch. Here's the thing about brookies, they are sensitive to temperature. If you're living in a state where you want to have brook trout, and let's say you're in Arizona, unless you're really high in the mountains where the water is going to stay cooler, you're probably not going to have much success, because once they hit about that mid to high 70-degree mark, they die. And they really do thrive in the 50 to 60-degree water temperatures. If you start going over that, you're going to lose your brook trout. So there's some places they just can't live for very long. Most of the time, you're going to find them in high elevation reservoirs. So across the state of Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, many places here in the West, you find them at high elevation. Same thing on the East Coast. If you're going to catch these fish and if they're going to do well, you typically want to have them in cool, clean water. They don't like turbid water either. So most fish biologists agree on this, is that brook trout typically will live between 4 and 10 years. There are some exceptions to the rule, but in most bodies of water, that's typically the lifespan for a brook trout. I know there's places here in Wyoming where they've aged them 10, 11 years old, but it can vary widely. And the size of the fish really depends on the water. And I think that goes with any fish species, right? If you have a bunch of bass in a southern reservoir and the forage isn't very good, they're not going to get very big. Same thing with brook trout. If the forage isn't good, if the conditions aren't right, they're not going to grow very big. But you can grow pretty big brook trout up to 10 and 11 pounds. And a lot of people are probably thinking, I usually catch the 7 and 8 inch brookies out of the stream. Well, yes, but in places like Labrador and Quebec, and even some places in the Mountain West, you can find brook trout that are fairly big. All across Canada, actually, there's some massive ones. There are places where they do grow big, and typically they have really good forage. A lot of time it can be like a freshwater shrimp variety that helps make them really big and fat, but it just depends on body of water to body of water. But they do have the ability to get pretty big. And let me tell you, a big brook trout is a sight to behold. They are beautiful. And especially like the big males, when they go into the spawn, can look super, super cool. Just like a lot of the char species around the spawn, they just get super, super colored up, very beautiful. So again, the forage really matters. All of us that have fished in the Mountain West have probably gone to a stream where you have hundreds of them. They bite like crazy, but they're all 5, 6, 7, 8 inches, and their head is abnormally large in comparison to the rest of their body. That's because they don't have a good forage base to feed from, so they don't get as big. And that's pretty common. In Wyoming, there are a few places, and same in the other Mountain West states, where you can catch them over 20 inches. It's hard to do, but that might be another bucket list thing for you, is go find a place that has them and then catch them. Sometimes they can be a little bit harder to catch, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So how do you fish for brook trout? Well, they eat a lot of different things, so it's actually not overly complicated. Like I said, catching the bigger ones can be a little bit more difficult, but honestly, they're fairly easy to catch, especially if you can find a whole bunch of stunted fish. You'll catch them pretty easy. A lot of people that I know, like fly fishermen, they love flies. So you can catch brook trout on a whole number of different flies, dry flies, wet flies, whatever. They're pretty readily going to take a fly in a presentation. Even if you're using spinning gear, you can use a clear bubble and a fly. But one of the fun things about brook trout is, if you're not a fly angler and you want to take a spinner or a spoon, a jig even, you can go up into the mountains and you can catch them that way, and they'll readily hit those things. In fact, I've got my biggest brook trout on big crankbaits. They will hit lots of different varieties of things. Some of the fly anglers really like to catch them on a mouse pattern. And that's because they do eat rodents that fall in the water. They'll eat sometimes baby birds that fall in the water. And they even eat snakes. And I know you probably don't believe that, but seriously, they'll eat water snakes. I was talking to my friend Jim Zumbo, and he had pictures of this. He was actually up in the Bighorns fishing, and he caught a brook trout that had a tail of a small water snake sticking out of it. And then later, he actually found a larger water snake that had caught a smaller brook trout and was eating it. So and I know that sounds crazy, But it is true, and I have seen it, and you can look it up, you can Google it. But those water snakes will actually eat some of the smaller brook trout, and vice versa. Some of the bigger brook trout will eat the snakes. So brook trout will eat just about anything. But if you're going to go to a place that has a lot of the smaller ones, you're going to have a lot more luck. If you're going to a trophy fishery, it's going to be a lot harder. Brook trout are pretty smart, they get conditioned. So if you're going to go after some of those big ones, you're going to have to be a little more sneaky and maybe a little more sophisticated. And you might have to have a little bit more options to throw at them in order to get the job done. So catching big brook trout is not easy. I can vouch for that. It is very difficult to catch big brookies, but super fun to try to do anyway. So the next portion of our show, I just want to say a huge thank you to Kafaru International. They came on as a sponsor here recently, and I've been using their stuff to go after these brook trout. So let me tell you, if you want the best pack in the industry to get into the backcountry, to go chasing after big brook trout, to go hunting, to go do all of those things, look no further than Kafaru. Kafaru is amazing. They make packs here in the US, actually, probably here in Riverton, Wyoming, where I'm located. And they are very tough packs. They're lightweight. They sit perfectly on your hips. They don't kill your back while you're trying to hike in. I actually used mine to help pack out my elk last year. I have a 44 mag is the one that I have, and I'll tell you what, that pack is gonna outlast me for sure. I'll be handing it down to my son probably. So Kafaru International makes some of the best packs out there. They also have a chest harness rig for fishing called the Steelhead. And I actually will have a picture up on here of a big brook trout that I caught while using the Steelhead. The Steelhead is great. You can have all of your gear right here on your chest, so it's easy to access and it makes your fishing a lot easier. So if you go to kafaru.net, you can use the code WISDOM at checkout and get 10% off your order. Again, go to kafaru.net, get 10% off your order. So yeah, go check those guys out. They're really awesome too. All right, let's talk about some of the struggles with brook trout. So just like a lot of the fish in North America around the time of industrialization, they kind of took a hit. So along the East Coast, along that whole native range of brook trout, they struggled. And a lot of that came from people went and they cut down a whole bunch of trees. There was a lot of silt that ran into the water. That silt didn't set well with those fish and it actually killed the fish. On the East Coast, it's kind of weird because, that's the native range for those fish. And they've actually struggled a little bit because of industrialization and overfishing and a lot of different things. Whereas they got brought out west in the mid to late 1800s and they've thrived. But again, they don't have the pressure. And then also, they don't have the environmental factors that have caused all the issues that they've had in the East. So it's just kind of interesting how, as years go by and environments change, things have drastically changed for them. Like I said, the opposite has been true in the West. We actually have too many brook trout. And so there's actually this program going on in various Western states where they're stocking what's called YY brook trout. And the whole idea behind that is that these are genetically modified so that when they spawn, they only produce males. So when they go to fertilize the eggs, it's just males, males, males until there's no females. And then they count on that 4 to 10 year lifespan that those fish are going to die out. And the hope in the West is that they can do that in some of these areas where they're way overpopulated. They've got too many of them. And then they can stock the native cutthroat trout species in their place. So the Wyoming Game and Fish Department is actually doing that in some areas right now. We'll see how that goes. I don't really have too much of an opinion on that just because I don't know how well it's going to work or not work. But there are definitely some places in Wyoming where they are way overpopulated, as well as on the West Coast. I mean, Oregon has them too, same problems. So it'll be interesting to see how this method actually works and see if they're able to reestablish some of the native cutthroat populations. And lastly, on this podcast, I do want to talk about one of my favorite things about brook trout, and that's eating them. Eating brook trout is a pleasure. They are one of the best fish in freshwater, I think, to eat. And you can argue that with me all day long, but if anybody's ever hiked for a day and a half or hiked really hard for a day, got up into the mountains, caught some brook trout, cleaned them up well, and had them over a campfire. They are absolutely delicious if done right. They can be absolutely amazing. So, we're going to talk about 3 different ways that I prepare brook trout. You can do it a whole bunch of different ways. So, obviously, my 3 ways that I'm going to share on here aren't the only ways, but they're easy to cook and they are delicious, in my opinion. The first way is to cook them in a cornmeal breading. And so all you really need is you need a hot skillet, you need some butter, and you need some seasoning and some cornmeal. And some people are willing to take that to a campsite that's kind of adjacent to a brookie spot. I'm probably not going to hike a skillet into the back country. I'm probably just going to take foil. But if you have a skillet and you want to cook it this way, it's really easy. So you catch the fish, you gut them, which all you do is you take a knife and you go up through the vent of the fish all the way up to here to around the neck and throat area of the fish. And then there's a little flap here right underneath the chin, is what I would say, of the fish, or the lower jaw. And you just kind of poke your knife through there and make a little hole. And you can grab like the gills and that whole gut and just rip it out and then toss it into the water, dispose of it however you're supposed to. Check the regulations where you are. But then what you want to do is you want to take your knife and actually cut, it's called a bloodline, and it runs on the inside of the rib cage up against the spine of the fish. So you're going to cut that, then you're going to take like your thumbnail or something like that, put it in the water and just kind of get that nasty bloodline out of there. And then your fish is all clean. So do that with your fish. Get them cleaned up really good. Make sure you get all the dirt and pine needles and all the other stuff off of them because you don't want to eat that. And then take it up to camp. And what I do is I'll have a mix of a little bit of cornmeal and some trout seasoning. And I like the one from High Mountain. They have like a Western style trout seasoning that's really good. And so you can just get one of their small shakers, pack it in there, put a little bit of that into your cornmeal, just get it on the fish. And then once you have your butter nice and hot in your skillet, you just fry the fish about 3 to 5 minutes on each side and make sure you cook it all the way through. And I'll explain why here in a second, but you want to get it cooked well enough so that you're not going to get sick, obviously. But once you're done, just scoop them out, put them on a plate, let them cool down a little bit. And then the method for getting the meat off of the bones, because a lot of people are like, well, how do you do it and not get a whole bunch of bones? Super simple. Grab the tail in one hand and lift it up. So the head's going to be down towards your plate. And you want to do this over your plate. And then you're going to take your fork and you're just going to kind of slowly and gently start pulling away the skin and the flesh off of the bones of the fish. And what'll happen is you'll see if you've cooked it well enough and you've cooked it properly, it'll just kind of start to fall off. You can just pull it right off and then switch sides, pull off the other side. If you haven't done it right, if it's not cooked all the way, it's not going to come off very easy at all. Maybe you should throw it back in the skillet. If you've overcooked it, your bones might come off and you might just have to pick through them. So there is a fine line between overcooking it and undercooking it. Like I said, it's about 3 to 5 minutes on each side. But one nice thing about cornmeal and butter is it'll crisp up a little bit. And so my mom was always notorious for this. And some of you will nod your heads as I explain this, but if you fry it well enough that the tail kind of crisps up, she called it a Rocky Mountain potato chip. You can actually nibble a little bit of the ends of the tail off. And I know it sounds kind of gross, but it's actually really good. So you can do that. You can kind of nibble the really crunchy ends off of there. Make sure it's obviously cooked all the way through and cooked really well. It needs to be crunchy, but brook trout that way is just phenomenal. The second way is to smoke them. And smoking brook trout is pretty easy. You can do it a couple of different ways. Like if you have them really small, you probably want to smoke them whole. It doesn't make a lot of sense to fillet small fish. You waste a lot of meat. It's just not really worth it. So if they're under 10 inches, 12 inches, you probably want to just smoke them whole. If they're bigger than that, then you have the option to really kind of fillet them and not lose too much. But most people, if they're smaller, will leave them whole. And what you want to do is gut them, do the same thing like I explained before. You want to wash them off really good, put them in a brine bowl. And my brine mix, my basic one, is really easy. 1 gallon of really cold water, 1 cup of salt, 1 cup of brown sugar. Mix it up really good so that it's all mixed. And so you don't have any granules in there. So you want it to be a liquid. Then what I do is I take some Worcestershire sauce, or however you say that word. It's horrible. It gets me every time. And you want to put in about a quarter cup of that. Mix it up really well. Submerge the fish in that. Leave them in there 6 to 12 hours. You can do it longer if you want it a little saltier. Pull them out of that brine the next day, rinse them with cold water, let them sit out and develop a pellicle, kind of dry out a little bit so that they're nice and tacky. Take them, put them in your smoker, smoke them till they're done. And you'll notice that it gets a lot smokier, tastes a lot better as long as you don't rush it and you get that pellicle on the meat and on the fish. That's one way to do it. If they're bigger, obviously you do the same with the fillet. If you fillet them out, pull them out, pat them dry, kind of get that pellicle developed, then smoke them. And it's really based on your preference of how long you want to smoke them. But smoked brook trout is amazing. And part of the reason for that is they do have high omega-3 fatty acids in them. So they're more oily fish essentially. So all the char, in my opinion, are vastly superior to other fish in a lot of ways for smoking, just because of that fact. They have higher oil content, so they taste better smoked. So give that a try. It's really good. And then lastly, if you're going to do a crazy long pack trip, like some of the ones that we do where you're going, 10 miles in, you probably want to go pretty basic. And so brook trout are really easy to make using this last recipe. So one of the ways that you can do it is you can take just a piece of tin foil, fold it up into a nice little square so you're not packing a lot of weight and it's pretty small. Take it up into the mountains, take a little bit of seasoning, like a little bit of salt and pepper. Hike in, catch your fish, gut them, clean them really well, put them inside that tin foil, put some seasoning on them, wrap them up really good, cook them over the fire in the tin foil, peel the tin foil off. Typically the skin comes right off. Like I said, you can pick them up by the tail and just pull it off with your fork. It's awesome that way. So cooking brook trout is super easy, super good. And I'll tell you what, one of the best eating fish, in my opinion, that's out there. So that would be a high recommendation, is if you're going to put all that work in to go into the backcountry, might as well eat some good protein and some good fat by having those. What I would end with is just, if you haven't had an opportunity to go fish for brookies, I highly recommend it, especially if you've got little kids. Brook trout in a small stream can keep kids entertained for hours. It is so much fun. And if you can teach them to stock up on brook trout in those little creeks, it gives the kids something really fun to do. I highly recommend that you take them brook trout fishing. There's a good chance that you have a brook trout fishery somewhere close by. If you don't know, contact your local game and fish or fish and game department. Talk to the fisheries biologist and say, hey, do we have any brook trout around? If you're a trophy hunter, and you want to catch that really big, massive wall hanging brook trout, say, hey, are there any places in my area where I can get a really big one? And they're probably going to give you at least some ideas. If you're going to go do that, you're going to want to try to take a few different options, because like I said, those can be a little bit harder to catch. Don't be afraid to throw the 3.5, 4-inch crankbait. Just giving you an idea from experience, because it does work. But yeah, go after those big brook trout, have a lot of fun, get lots of pictures with them. If you're fishing a trophy area, I would say if you can catch and release, try to do that. Try to keep those bigger fish around, because like I said, they only live that 4 to 10 year lifespan. So it is kind of cool to have them in there. If you decide to take them home, that's great too. But enjoy the fishing, enjoy brook trout. And I hope you learned a little bit of something about brook trout. Like I said, I learned a couple of new things that I didn't know, and they are one of the coolest fish out there and so much fun to catch. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Angling Wisdom, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.
Thanks for listening to the Angling Wisdom Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please go to patreon.com/anglingwisdom to sign up for bonus content or just to show your support for the show. You can also subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching this podcast. You can follow us on the socials by searching for Angling Wisdom on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks again to PK Lures for sponsoring this show. You can go to pklure.com and use the code WISDOM to receive 20% off of your next order. And of course, you can always go to anglingwisdom.com for more fishing content. This is Patrick Edwards signing off. I hope to see you out on the water.